book, you talked about like you spoke at a memorial for the 2017 mosque shooting in Quebec City, and I think I haven't seen a lot of that in my I'm going to say my limited view and my limited, and it really inspired me when I think about what does it mean to say that we're building solidarity across difference, but to embody it. And to me, that is it. Just was a deep breath there when I was reading that part of it. Um, and just that recognition that really, you know, I think about the convoy, and I know that's probably like a bit of an out there, but I think about the experience where about a year ago, where the feeling of othering and there seemed to be a huge gap that became very apparent for a lot of people around. Okay, if you are someone who supports the convoy, then I can't talk to you because I don't. And again, I might be projecting some of my own experience because I felt my limits as someone who does this work and as someone who prides themselves on trying to see the humanity in everyone, even if mine isn't seen by another person. I struggled in that moment. Um, but coming back to kind of the way you write this book and the way that you approach engaging the reader. So I know you talked in our earlier show about the origins for you of like, yeah, I was frustrated and angry with conversations happening at the church, and so although that may have been some of who you were writing for, maybe amongst your in addition to writing for yourself, I've heard that authors should start by writing for themselves and then focus outwards. I felt like I was being spoken to in this book, even though I'm not in necessarily the congregation or the faith that you're in. The importance of community and doing this with people, and even trying to connect, because I think one of the things I've heard a lot of in Halton, and I think that's really changed in the last couple of years with the emergence. There's a lot more Indigenous focused organizations and groups that I'm going to say have become visible from being, from as opposed to being invisible, due to colonization and that idea that, oh, there's no Indigenous people here. How is that? How is that the case? And so I feel like there's been a shift, and I think we still have a lot more work to do here in Halton to make sure that we're taking the time, rather than, oh, I emailed these 3 organizations once, they didn't reach out to me, so I don't have any relationship. What does it look like to keep trying? What does it look like to be committed to developing that relationship? I wonder if there's anything you can offer around, from your lens, what does that mean to be committed to building relationship?
Yeah. So I grew up in Niagara, with my maternal family. So I grew up with, in a German, Ukrainian, they came as refugees in the early 50s. And, my paternal family was all kind of north of Thunder Bay. You go to Thunder Bay, turn right at the end of the road. That's where my family is, where the roads end. But I didn't know them. I didn't know them. And of course, this is long before social media, right? This is, 60s, 70s, early 80s, long before social media. So, excuse me. And so I grew up in Niagara. I had no idea that there were Indigenous people in the Niagara region. No idea. It was a friendship center. I had no idea. I didn't know it existed. There were 2 reserves within less than 2 hours from me. I had no idea. I thought I was the only Native person and that the rest of them all lived out west somewhere, possibly in teepees. I wasn't sure. And then as I grew up, found my father, started going to protests. And that's what I tell people is just like show up. Just start with showing up, because that's what I did. And you say, writers should write for themselves. I realized after a few of these conversations that I kind of did write it for myself, because I didn't grow up in the midst of my community. So how do I become good kin to my kin, to my own community? How do I become a good relative to my own relatives? And so that's also kind of my own trajectory, is when I tell people to show up, that's what I did. I started showing up. I started showing up at the Friendship Center in Toronto. You show up enough, you start becoming familiar. I started showing up at protests, listening to the speakers that were talking. And then when we moved down to Niagara, because I was living in Brampton for a while, and then we moved down to Niagara, I had to start again. And again, I didn't know there were Native people in Niagara. 2 friendship centers by this point. I didn't know until I started working in child welfare. And what a sad story that is. that I had to be working in child welfare in order to encounter the Indigenous community. That's really sad. And I talk about my time in child welfare and how challenging that eventually became for me. Um, but again, I started showing up. I started showing up at protests. I started showing up at activities. You become familiar. People start talking to you. If you volunteer, if you offer to wash dishes, you'll make friends fast. And you talked before about reading the books. Reading the books is part of the work, and then it helps you to ask better questions when you do have conversations. And I talk often in the book about the hand drum group that I belong to, the Strong Water Singers. And that's also a really good example of internal organizing and growing and changing, because we used to be called the Strong Water Women. And then because the hand drum group is traditionally something the women, men sing around the big drum and women sing, men sing hand drum too. But it was a women's hand drum group. And then one day at the group, there was a non-binary person was there. And I thought, oh, okay, we need to change our name. And I mentioned this to, kind of the woman who leads the group. And she's like, yeah. And boom, just like that, the name was changed. And, and so those are the kinds of things that we can do because we're all organized somewhere, right? We're all in some kind of community. And those are the kinds of things that we can do. So I noticed something. I had that one person to disrupt with. I mentioned it to her and she's like, absolutely, changing the name. And now we're the Strong Water Singers, just like that. And it's those kinds of changes that we can start doing those things.